And I've learned sometimes the hard way that if you misunderstand what a contract means in a culture, you misunderstand the people themselves. Hello, and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. I'm John Stech, your host on this journey. We travel the globe to bring you stories about culture and the global automotive industry. Fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. Recently, I signed a new rental agreement for an apartment here in Bangkok. Reading through the agreement and analyzing it for any, gotchas reminded me of the many agreements that I reviewed while working in the international automotive industry. The longer that I've lived and worked around the world, the more I've realized something strange. A contract, this thing that we treat as universal, as objective, as rational, is anything but that. In some countries, a contract is like a promise. In others, it's a shield. In others, it's a suggestion. And in a few places, it's a beautifully formatted piece of theater that everyone signs while somehow quietly agreeing that the real deal is happening somewhere else. I've sat at tables where the contract was the relationship, and at tables where the contract was just the opening handshake. And I've learned sometimes the hard way that if you misunderstand what a contract means in a culture, you misunderstand the people themselves. So today, I want to take you on a tour, 6 countries in which I've either lived or worked, uh, 6 different ways of understanding trust, obligation, and the written word. And maybe by the end, you'll see your own assumptions on contracts a little differently. Contracts are not merely documents. They're cultural artifacts. They tell you where a society places trust in systems or in people or in relationships or in flexibility. They tell you how a culture handles uncertainty, and they tell you whether the future is something to be controlled, predicted, or adapted to. So as we move through these 6 countries, the United States, Germany, Russia, China, Brazil, and Egypt, I want you to listen for the deeper story because underneath every clause and signature is a completely different worldview. Let's start with the United States, the place where the contract is the deal, and the country with, frankly, the fifth highest density of lawyers per capita, like 1.3 million of them. In the US, the written word is a defensive tool. Contracts are long and detailed and drafted to anticipate every possible disaster. If you've seen a 40-page agreement for something that could have been handled in 2 paragraphs, then, well, then you've seen an American fear of that ambiguity at work. Americans trust the system. They trust courts, they trust enforceability, and because of that, they're comfortable doing business with people that they barely know because the contract is that fundamental safety net. Negotiations tend to be fast and transactional. Like what are we agreeing to? What's the price? What's the timeline? Boom, done, sign on the bottom line. But here's the catch. Americans often assume that once the ink is dry, the conversation's over. Other cultures don't see it that way. And that's where the misunderstandings can begin. Now, Germany. If the US sees contracts as shields, Germany sees them as a engineering document. For Germans, clarity is respect. A contract should be precise and structured and aligned with reality. It's not about anticipating disaster. It's about describing the world accurately. The negotiations can be slow, they're thorough and deeply technical. And they want to understand every detail because they want the contract to be a faithful model of what's actually going to happen. And once it's signed, well, that's it. Deviating from the contract isn't just inconvenient, it really feels like a breach of integrity. Oh, we agreed to this. Why are we changing it? To outsiders, this can feel really rigid. To Germans, it's professionalism. And when working in a German American organization, this can lead to some seriously long, drawn out discussions. I remember having numerous meetings until sunset, along with pizza dinners during my years at Daimler Chrysler, a former German American tie up in the early 2000s. Now, we moved to a completely different universe, Russia. I spent 7 years here, first with an American company, Chrysler, and later with a Swedish company, Volvo. On my arrival, I thought of contracts through my German American lens. I didn't anticipate what I would actually find in Russia. Here, there was an altogether different attitude to the signatures at the bottom of the page. Now, in Russia, the contract matters, but it's not the ultimate guarantee. The real guarantee is the relationship, the loyalty, the network, the power dynamics. The written word is just one tool among many. But even then, the Russians do love their paper. Contracts were always extensive and ultimately had to be signed in multiple spots, plus stamped with the official company stamp for authentication. When Fiat Chrysler Russia was formed in 2011, it required migrating about 115 Fiat dealers from a separate distribution company to ours. For each dealer, there were two franchises, passenger cars and commercial vehicles. So for each dealer, there were four printed contracts, two for them and two for us. Each contract was about 50 pages long and required 10 signatures from me. That's 4,600 signatures from my pen. You should have seen my office. Those 23,000 sheets of paper ended up in two stacks. Each one was well over a meter tall. I even had to schedule an hour of signature time with my network director every single evening until the contracts were finished. But even with those 23,000 sheets of paper, flexibility is still high. Terms shift, circumstances change, and in a society where institutions haven't always been reliable, people they learn to trust people, not paper. This was even more complex in a country with Byzantine accounting and tax laws that seem to shift more than sand on a beach. This flexibility, though, you can also use it to your advantage if you understand the system as an outsider. I remember one particular situation where a Chrysler dealer in Russia was wrangling the other dealers with his negative attitude and really undermining the whole network. One Friday evening, he spitefully sent a faxed letter of resignation from the dealer network, a hollow threat that he used to put pressure on my team. After a very short meeting with my top management team, I wrote approved along with that day's effective date and faxed back the letter. The following Monday, we started the process of offboarding the dealer. This process was absolutely not according to the contract, but capitalizing on the flexibility of contracts was absolutely the right thing to do to purge this harmful dealer from our network. To Westerners, this can feel really unpredictable, and to Russians, it's just realistic, whether they like that result or not. China offers yet another model, the contract as a snapshot of today's understanding. Although I've not personally worked in China, I had colleagues from several of my previous employers, Chrysler and Volvo, who would often hold their heads in their hands and tell me all about it. In China, the written contract is important, but it's not final. It's just the starting point, a moment in time, a reflection of the relationship as it exists right now. The real enforcement mechanism is guanxi, the network of relationships, obligations, and mutual dependence. If the relationship is strong, the contract can bend. If the relationship weakens, the contract probably won't save you. Renegotiation is normal. Adaptation is expected, and insisting on rigid adherence can be either seen as frankly naive or even disrespectful. To Americans, this feels like moving the goalposts, and to Chinese partners, it's just adapting to reality. And it was this sense of moving goalposts that had kept my colleagues from Chrysler and Volvo awake on very many nights. Brazil brings warmth and improvisation into the picture, but also it brings world class complexity and a legal system that shifts daily. That's why Brazil has the fourth highest lawyer density per capita in the world. And as for their tax laws, these changed so often, I simply couldn't understand how our accounting or legal departments could keep up at Volvo Car Brazil. While leading the Latin America region for Volvo, I remember having many conversations and seemingly endless questions from my Brazilian colleagues on their shifting strategies. At first, I thought they just couldn't keep a consistent strategy. But then I learned that the legal frameworks were continuously changing and product and pricing strategies had to be aligned again and again and again. Ultimately, in Brazil, contracts are important, especially in formal business settings, but they're interpreted with flexibility. Life happens, circumstances, they shift, people adapt, just like I learned in those many conference calls on the shifting strategy. Relationships matter enormously. Warmth, trust, and personal connection are often carry more weight than the rigid adherence to the text. When I would meet members of Volvo's dealer network, the initial focus was always on building that personal rapport. And yes, eventually the written contracts would follow. Deadlines, guidelines, terms, everything negotiable. The spirit of the agreement often matters more than the actual letters. And thanks to the shifting legal frameworks, the built in flexibility was a necessity to keep from having to add hundreds of addendums. To outsiders, this can feel inconsistent, did to me. To Brazilians, it's human and it's completely normal. And then there's Egypt, a really fascinating hybrid. Daimler Chrysler was my first overseas assignment, a German American company with a really complicated legal approach in a country that values not only the contractual complexity, but also the human elements of business agreements. Egyptian contracts, they're formal, they're detailed, and they're bureaucratic. They're essential for legitimacy, especially in government or large corporate settings. But the execution, that's purely relational. That's human, and that's negotiated. At one point, Chrysler wanted to open a dealer in Hurghada along the Red Sea. There were two partners we looked at, but one was a service expert and the other a sales expert, and each really focused only on their specialty. We brought them together with the idea that they form a joint venture in Hurghada where each handles their own specialty in order to have an effective new dealership. The two company leaders, they met offsite for several days, reportedly screaming and talking and fighting and agreeing and disagreeing behind closed doors. But once they emerged, they had found their common goals. A personal bond and a contract was signed to underscore their new partnership. Egypt has a long administrative tradition, but also a deeply relational culture. So you get this interesting duality. The contract is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The real work happens through trust and reputation and personal networks. Even if reaching an agreement, that's through a painful process. To Westerners, this can feel very unpredictable. To Egyptians, it's just a pragmatic adaptation to a complex system. So, what do we do with all of this? How do we make sense of six completely different approaches? Well, I see three global models. I think there's the system trust culture where the US and Germany lead. The contract is the anchor, and then the system is reliable, and predictability is ultimately the goal. Then there's the relationship trust cultures, China, Brazil, and Russia, where the contract is a tool, but the relationship is the real guarantee. And of course, flexibility is expected. Then there's the hybrid, bureaucratic relational culture with Egypt. The contract it legitimizes, but the relationship is what operationalizes the whole thing. And the system, well, ultimately complicates it. Once you see these models, you start to understand why cross cultural business can feel like a comedy of errors. Everyone thinks they're being reasonable, everyone thinks they're being clear, but frankly, they're all playing different games. So let me leave you with this. Every contract is a cultural story about trust. It tells you what people fear, what they value, and how they believe the world works. And when we misunderstand the story, we misunderstand the people, our business partners. The next time you sign something abroad, just pause for a second and ask yourself, is this a promise? Is it a prediction? Is it a formality? Is it the beginning of a relationship? Because the meaning of a contract, it's not in the paper, it's the culture that produced it. And if you can learn to read that, I mean, really read it to understand it, then you'll understand not just the deal, but the people behind it. And it will make you that much more effective when living or working in a country that's not your own. And to round that out, I have to finish by saying that I did ultimately sign that rental agreement, and I'll be moving apartments in the month of February. Until next time, keep on driving. Thank you for joining us on today's journey. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Auto Ethnographer and leave us a rating or comment. For more information, visit our website at auto-ethnographer.com. You can also follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.